Welcome to Discuss Detroit, where we have conversations with small business owners, community leaders, and Detroit residents about the city that we love. To watch videos of these conversations, visit thecityinstitute.com/discuss Detroit or follow City Institute on YouTube. Now for today's show. And today's guest is one of my favorite people in Detroit, Lauren Hood, founder and director, the Institute for AfroUrbanism. Hi, Lauren.
Hi, Jeanette.
Hey, Lolo.
Hey, Net.
We go back a little ways too. I think that was those nicknames came from like a drunken night in Chicago, if I recall vaguely
Yep,
correctly.
that tracks for me as well. Yep.
Probably like 15, 16, 2000. I don't even know. When were you in Chicago? We can
Oh,
come back to
dang. It
that.
would have been like '08.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Nice. Anyway, so on that note, that's a great way to start. You know, I always ask people for their origin story. So what's the Lauren Hood origin story? Where'd you come from? Where were you born? Where raised?
Mm-hmm.
Were your formative years?
Born at Henry Ford Hospital, March 5th, 1972. I have a milestone birthday coming up in about 3 days.
Happy early
Um,
birthday.
Thank you. It's a thing. Um, and raised on the northwest side of Detroit. So my parents bought their house, um, the corner of Pinehurst and Margarita, a couple blocks away from Northwest Activity Center in 1969, and lived there until 2013. So I felt very privileged to have um, that is my permanent residence. So even as I moved around the city and moved to other cities, I always felt like I had the Northwest side to come back to. Like even when I lived in other places, I never changed the address on my driver's license. So I felt very rooted in the address at 18600 Pinehurst. So I'm of the Northwest side. However, I feel like a lot of the experiences that shaped me came from school. So although I grew up in this all black, middle class, working class neighborhood, I got shipped out to private school in the burbs where there was, a very small handful of black kids. So a lot of my formative years were spent like bouncing between these two worlds, an all black like home life and then a multicultural school life. And I think I always say that kind of set me up for doing the kind of work I do now, which is like, acting as a liaison between these two groups of folks, being able to speak a couple different languages, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So then when did you leave Detroit for the first time?
Mm, the year 2000, I lived in Chicago. Um, what took me to Chicago in particular? I just wanted to have a different kind of experience. I think I was going through a I'm too big for this place kind of vibe. I was like, Detroit can't hold me. I need a bigger city. But I didn't want to. Well, actually, I'd done an internship in New York, and I knew New York wasn't it. So I was like, what's a nice, New York light? So I was like, let me try Chicago for a little bit. So I lived in Chicago for about 4 years. Um, but then I think what brought me back home was I started to pay attention to the changes that were happening in the city and noticing that, it didn't seem like a lot of native Detroiters were at the helm. So I wanted to come back home and see how I could, um, get engaged in what was going on.
And then I know part of that journey was the Masters in Community Development, right, at
Hmm.
UDM.
For sure. So I actually started out in an MBA program. I'd always had a vision for running my own business or what I thought that meant. Um, I always wanted my own venue where I could create experiences for people. And I was like, oh, yeah, you get an MBA to like run your own business. But actually, like an MBA program in Michigan is more like how to be middle management at GM. So, like, everybody in my classes were like, would show up in their suits um, and yeah, it just wasn't what I was looking for. It didn't feel very liberated. It was very much like how to fit yourself into a giant corporate structure. And I was like, ooh, I don't want to be a cog. Um, So in one of my classes, though, there was this woman who was like, there's a community development master's program. I think that is more your speed. I was like, let me try that out. So I always give props to my friend Robin, who like introduced me to this whole new world of possibility. So I got in that program and yeah, totally like got my life, as the kids say.
Yeah, and what that was around, so because you somewhere in that time frame, I think, is when you did your stint working for us when we were called Inside Detroit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a
Yeah.
lot
So
of folks
yeah.
don't know we've been around 16 years. So we launched in 2006 as Inside Detroit, and then brand change in collaboration with Hive, and then Detroit Experience Factory. Now we're expanding even more with the City Institute. And I just love having touch points in different people's lives where like so many people have connected through our organization over the years. And I'm proud I get to say that Lauren worked for us for just a little bit during that kind of discovery phase, probably, right? Around the
Sure did.
community.
Yeah, I remember I was doing like double duty at the time. So I was working for you and also working in economic development at the city of Highland Park. And
Oh,
just like having those experiences at the same time was interesting.
yeah. Well,
Mm-hmm.
and I know we were like, oh, could you help? You know, we really need someone to help with the office stuff, which
Mm-hmm.
is definitely not like the best use of your, not saying you can't do
But
it,
I
it's that
mean,
it's
yeah,
not
you
the
don't know
best
that until
use
you
of your
try it.
skill set, yeah. But yeah, you don't
Mm-hmm.
know. Like I did, in college, I ended up like doing stuff like for the college radio, and then I had an internship and it happened to be public relations. And then all of a sudden I had all this like PR stuff. And I was like, but I don't want to do that, but you don't know it
Yeah.
until you kind of try it a little bit, right?
And there's like a point in one's career where you can start to, negotiate what your position is. Like at the time, I didn't feel like I had enough experience to be like, yeah, I'm not doing that stuff, you know? But now I get to pick whether or not I work in my genius zone. Like I know what my skill set is and I know what it isn't. So
Amen.
whenever people are like bringing me opportunities, I'm like, that's not going to work for me. What about this? And if they can't fit into, the way I've described and positioned my work, I can't do it. And mostly right now, I just want to do work that is self-driven. Like I've done enough stuff like fulfilling other people's visions. Um, I'm ready to graduate. It's my time. So the work I do now is mostly self-directed.
And you deserve it. Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest things is knowing your skill sets and knowing what they're not and being okay with that. Like it's, people all
Totally.
say like, oh, I'm really bad at design or spatial stuff, and people are like, oh no, and I'm like, I'm not saying that to say like, woe is me. It's just a fact. And so then it frees me actually to not try to
Yeah.
devote my time to like be better at something that is not
Mm-mm.
my natural
I don't
skill.
need to be good at operations.
Yeah,
I have people for that
yeah. That
that
is
are
one of
really
those
good at it and passionate about it.
huge lessons learned over the years.
Hmm.
Absolutely. So speaking of where you are now, the Institute for AfroUrbanism, founder and director, tell us kind of how that came to be. I think it probably is similar to like that you wanted to do what you want to do and making it happen, which is I think one of your skill sets for sure is just making stuff happen.
I think it emerged from having been a part of all of these institutional processes for planning and developing neighborhoods and doing projects in Detroit, and realizing that culture was never a part of the conversation. Um, or when we would mention Black, it would be in the context of people who need like subsidies and support and help. It never came from a place of recognizing that we have everything we need. There's just a system that imposes barriers upon us that don't let us thrive. Um, and also recognizing that most of the people that were leading this work were like white folks that were either from the suburbs or like from out of state. And when you don't have anyone in a team context that understands the Black lived experience, like designing and planning for Black people, there's so much that gets left out. And I, as like the person who was usually brought on to do engagement, but who also took on like cultural and historical context as part of my work, um, it just like it doesn't fit. Those teams, usually led by architects and planners, create a very small hole for what engagement is. And what it needs to be is something that's like guiding the entire process. But when you don't have the context for what a Black lived experience is, but you're trying to plan for our communities, like, I don't know, you miss so many things.
Yeah.
And yeah, so the Institute emerged as a way to center the Black lived experience when planning and developing in Black communities. Pretty straightforward. And it
Yeah.
seems like why would you need to do that? It seems elementary that you would like lead with the culture and lead with the lived experience of the people, but it's something that I have seen that we just don't do or
Absolutely.
don't do well.
Right. I mean, for all those reasons that you mentioned, because the people normally leading don't have that lived experience, right?
Yeah, it's considered that their lived experience is just the quintessential lived experience of everyone, and Black folks and white folks, and particularly in the racialized America we live in today, are having really different experiences.
Well, and then even within the Black community as well, obviously, it's not, like it's not just monolithic,
Yeah,
right? Like,
correct.
and I think part the segregation in our region, and that's why I'd love your thoughts on, when you went to Chicago, what was some of the similarities and differences? I think one of the things that being traveling is actually what helps you, if I believe, right, learn more about where you're from, actually, right? I think
Yeah.
we're so often Detroiters, either we might not leave Detroit, or we think, I've had people say, oh, this is only in Detroit. Like I had someone say, well, they don't have homeless people in Chicago. And it's like, well, you obviously haven't been, or being on the magnificent, going for a vacation or a weekend is not being in a city, any city, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there are similarities, but there are differences. As you've traveled, what are some of those? I mean, whether it's Chicago or other things, like, is the segregation, do you feel the segregation more here? Is on a map, it looks,
Yes, very much so.
yeah,
So you feel it in Chicago, but I feel it more so in Detroit. And maybe it's because I'm super rooted here and I can, see more clearly what's happening, because I'm kind of connected to it. But I mean, there's segregation here, even like, yes, neighborhood to neighborhood, but like building to building in certain parts of the city. Um, Even in spaces, I would argue that this co-working space I'm in right now, there's a Black section and a white section. Um, yeah, it's what the harm that our region has experienced due to like our unresolved racial trauma, is just really palpable to me. And I've had friends that come from other places who get here and are like, whoa, like this black white divide, they can like, you can taste it when you get here. Um, it's just, it's deep.
yeah,
We got some healing to do.
absolutely. And I mean, well, that's why we talk so much about the history and the context, because helping people understand how we got here. And that's both, I mean, certainly I feel like Black Detroiters know more about that history part. Obviously, they've lived it in many cases, but like so many things that it wasn't talked about, or there's misinformation or pieces of things out there.
Well, let me tell
So
you about that.
yeah.
So, as we were discussing earlier, like I just came from the congregation. So that's a church, like right at 12th and Claremont, where
Mhm.
actually my parents got married in. But my grandmother lived on Claremont, like 5 houses off of that intersection. And it only occurred to me like at the 50th anniversary mark where people were like, yes, and the origins of the uprising were at 12th and Claremont. And I was like, whoa, that's where my grandma lived. And I was like, Mom, like, were you there? Was grandma there, like, when the stuff happened? She's like, oh, yeah. I'm like, how have we not had a discussion about this? Like, in all the years, we didn't talk about that. Both my grandmothers lived there. My one grandmother was at 1996 Claremont, which is like 5 houses off the intersection. And my dad's mom was on Atkinson, which is like the next street over. And they were both there during the uprising, and never did I hear these stories growing up. Like, how is this possible? So I had to, dig and pry. I'm like, so what happened? And what were you and dad doing? And what did that feel like? And did you see the tanks? And was it scary? The way my mom describes it, she's like, well, your father and I still had to go to work. I'm like, work was still happening? Like, it was my understanding that, like, nobody was doing anything in the city except, like, hankering down, trying to, stay safe. But she's like, no, we still had to do things. And it's really interesting. What I came to understand is I think it was a traumatic experience, yes, but maybe a little embarrassing, because the way that I always understood it was that black folks kind of went crazy one day and scared all the good white people in the jobs out to the suburbs, was kind of what I grew up feeling about that time period. And it just made me wonder, like, is there some shame associated with that? Because, I've been calling it a riot forever until, again, I want to say at the 50th anniversary mark when we started having different kinds of conversations about it. And in asking myself, like, why didn't my parents ever talk to me about it? I'm like, maybe there was some shame there, you know? There wasn't like this social political understanding that, the uprising was a response to behavior on, the part of the police, city government. Like, we could afford good houses, but they wouldn't let us live in them. We were
Yeah.
qualified for good jobs, but we couldn't have them. So,
The Fair Housing Act didn't happen until 68. I mean, it was literally
yeah,
illegal. Like the federal government still, was you couldn't get a home loan in America if you were black. I mean, in 1967. I
yeah.
mean,
So it
but
just makes me wonder
yeah,
if the reason it didn't get talked about in my household when my parents were right at the epicenter, is because there's some shame that hasn't been resolved around what happened then.
and that makes sense too, because the narrative, the larger regional narrative was that, was obviously the media was all white at the time, or, vast majority, right? And that's something that obviously we all talked about and worked on the Detroit 67 project, and, which I think was amazing and super necessary. The whole idea of looking back to move forward. And obviously our good friend Marlo, who we miss dearly, it was instrumental in making sure those conversations happened, and right, and taking it outside of the museum. But as we've been talking with people and doing more around those historic contexts, that I have heard from both black and white that there's just these large pieces that have not been, or not realizing the connection to things, that
Mm-hmm.
everything's connected, right? Whether it's we had slavery in Detroit that wasn't talked about, right, until
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Miles really wrote that
Well, I
book.
think, and that's part of the problem. Jaman always likes to say we have collective amnesia, but I think there's also something to be said for having a critical consciousness about these things. There's one thing to like know the history, but it's like another thing to understand how the implications are manifest in what we see today. Lots
Yes.
of people like to be like, "Oh my God, redlining was so horrible. Oh, Detroit had slaves. How terrible. All of these ways that black folks were harmed. That's too bad." But they don't connect it to the
Right.
manifestation of the way the city looks today. People, for some
74.
reason, can't do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of like why when I'm talking about connecting the dots in the context is about how it impacts us today, so that you people, you can't, I don't think you can also work towards a solution if you don't understand how it happened in the first place. And
And most
especially,
of the people leading
right,
are leading these
don't,
processes of
yeah.
change in the city do not have that context nor the critical consciousness to understand how it's connected to what's happening today.
Like 74% of redlined areas are low income today in America. Like
Mm-hmm.
that is, I mean, anyway, so I know we can talk about data and all that. I mean, and it's been a learning journey for me as well. And we did our redlining, racism and segregation presentation for the Michigan Democratic Black Caucus. And I was
Mm-hmm.
like really nervous about it. I was like, you guys know this stuff. Like, why do you want, I mean, but they were like, you weave these pieces together, make and help us tell that story. You're helping us build the case for reparations. That's what
Mm-hmm.
all of these things that like
And it's
67 wasn't in a
interesting
silo,
too, yes, it's interesting too that more people now want to understand the racialized history of the city. Like for you, have you always done like the racial
It's always
segregation?
been part of every tour, like, because that you can't, oh, look at this cool new restaurant and that was an abandoned
Mm-hmm.
building. Why was it abandoned, right? So we always, like, every tour would talk about the Burwood Wall, and in facts, and like touch on briefly on 67.
But now you can have a whole tour just on
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And well, with virtual too, we can, like before, it would also be an all day thing, and Jamon and I partnered on during 67 50th anniversary on these tours, because the Burwood Wall leads to what happened in 67, the destruction of Black. It's all leads to what happened then. And but to go from OC and Sweet House on the east side to the Burwood Wall, back to Black Bottom, back to 12th and Claremont, on a person is absolutely doable, but it takes all day. And so now with virtual, it just became that tool that in an hour and a half, we can give this very quick overview, but then because it's virtual too, we can have links here to learn. This is only scratching the surface. Here's all these resources. Go talk to Jamon some more. Go talk to this, read this book.
Have you found that organizations are more interested now than they were like in a pre-Floyd world?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think also the way, that is talking about my skill set. I realize is that data nerd who can communicate, like that overlap where it isn't just a dry history, but it's, it's how it's the emotion of what happened, but also how it still impacts us today. But then also what are people doing like that, to move us forward? And you're a great example of that. So I mean, speaking of reparations, I think aren't you on the new reparations task force or
Not on the task force.
Not on the
I
task
am
force?
I am on a steering committee.
Okay.
So there's a small group of us that have been working with Council President Sheffield and her people to create a process by which this task force will be selected. So we work together to draft the first resolution. Work together also with Keith Williams from the Michigan Democratic Black Caucus to draft and pass the resolution to establish a task force. So no one's on it yet, but yes, I'm engaged in helping them set up that process.
And that's a new, not a new concept, obviously by any means, but more people are willing to have that conversation, you think?
They are,
right?
and for me, for me, it was a leveling up. I used to always want to talk about equitable development, but I don't even know what that means. What does equity look like? People like to throw around that word. I don't even use it anymore because I can't define it for you. So if I can't define it, why am I talking about it? But I know what reparations is. So to me, reparations is a 3-part process. It's an acknowledgement that some harm was done, which I really think is the first step in Black folks thriving. So that shame I talked about earlier, the federal government or even local government said, Black people, the way your neighborhood looks today is not your fault. We did this to you and we apologize. Like that would allow us to let go of all that shame we've been carrying for decades. And I think, we can start to thrive on our own accord. There are all these programs and subsidies that are offered. And yes, people need direct services like today. But I assure you that if people could let go of that shame and that pain, like we could thrive on our own accord. So 3 parts. It's sorry we did this to y'all. The second is, some sort of compensation. But in my mind, the compensation doesn't have to be like a check or a free house. It could be a free education. It could be free mental health care. It could look a lot of different ways, but you have to talk to people to figure out the way that they wish to be made whole. I think a problem that we have is institutionally, we like to figure out, oh, this is what people need. Like, no. You can't imagine what people need, but people know what they need. But you have to have those conversations and a process that allows folks who have been impacted to participate in determining what the compensation is going to look like. So the acknowledgement, the compensation, and then a shift in policy to ensure that we don't do it again. So you have to establish a new set of like governing norms that make sure that the harm does not happen again. It's those 3 things that have to happen.
That's a really, great job on, I'm sure you guys have worked on that, because that is those are impactful, measurable, understandable, and imperative, absolutely. I think, that the last one about making sure things don't happen again is also like, so important, right? Because we're doing things again, right? Whether it's disenfranchising voters,
We're
hate,
in a period of urban renewal, just like we were in the 40s, 50s,
right?
60s. It's the
And,
same thing. It
and when
just
I
has
tell
different
people about
words.
it, like Kobo wasn't destroying this, like just saying, I mean, he was like saying this is progress, right? And like, and the narrative is very similar to today, right? And understanding those correlations is why we talk about it, right? Is one of the many reasons. I mean, but also even what redlining looked like today, zoning, right? In the suburbs,
Mm-hmm.
especially, like is today's version of redlining. How can somebody, I mean, and helping people again, I think people are more interested in knowing, I should say white people are more interested than they have been, which is part of the reason we started. It was like after George Floyd, a lot of people just were like, what, racism, kind of, and I guess it's better late than never,
Mm-hmm.
right? I don't, I mean, I guess, right, but that's where helping people see that is, and I've seen people going, wow, I never knew. And I can see a little bit of a movement. I mean, it's not what is necessary, but it does feel like a beginning. And even having, building up to the task force,
Mm-hmm.
but at the same time, obviously I mean, it's a complicated and there's a lot of stuff out there.
It's in my mind also the reparations process needs to go on in perpetuity until racism no longer exists and the whole of humanity is some shade of beige. um, that's how long the process needs to last. There will always be some racialized harm to account for. Um, so I don't think, that process
It's
just
not a
can't look at
one-off.
harms. Yeah, it can't just look backwards. There's harm presently and into the future. And we need to establish, some body that will address those issues as they continue to occur.
What's the timeline for the task force? And do they,
Has not been established.
yeah,
So the first public meeting that we had last week was to talk about that, was to talk about like term limits, criteria for people to be on the task force, the selection process. The steering committee group didn't want to be prescriptive in how any of that was set up. So we even took, those things in front of the public for a discussion.
great. And how does that tie in? I mean, you're with the Institute for AfroUrbanism and you're in the work that, because
Well,
you're
like
just
I said, yeah.
launching that, right? It's a newer.
Well, I've been working on it for, let me see, maybe mid 2020.
Yeah.
But
Pandemic project.
yep. And I was very intentional about how the word got out. So the University of Detroit Mercy is the fiduciary for the first two grants. And, their PR department wrote a press release, but it was really university heavy. And a lot of the work that I'm doing needs to be demonstrating that a Black woman who is a native Detroiter can get financial support for a grassroots um, for a grassroots initiative to address issues in a Black-centered way. I like to think of my work as like a permission slip. So all the little Black kids in Detroit who are planning out their futures, thinking about what they can look at this institute and be like, oh, I can have my own initiative and people will support it. Like, yes, that's an option for you. But if the story comes out that like, oh, this university got money to like help an alumni do a thing, like that's not the real story. Like I went out with my concept and raised the money through my own relationships with philanthropy based on previous work that I did. Like that needs to be the story so that other little Black kids know it's a possibility. Um, and I also think, like, I know you want to talk a little about the France trip. Like everything that the institute does is to serve as a permission slip for other Black folks to be like, yeah, you can get this, you can do this.
Yeah. So that was what I said. So it
Yeah.
started, and then what are some of the things? I know one of those was taking an amazing group of people to Paris.
Yeah. Well, in thinking about like what is the ethos of the institute, I really wanted to center the notion of Black thriving. I think a lot of the work that we do in Black communities, it's deficit based. It's like poor, marginalized, disinvested, underserved. And I think when you use words like that, people start to embody the behavior of people who are disenfranchised and underserved. And I'm like, okay, I know from the law of attraction that whatever you put your energy into grows. So if I keep saying underserved, it's a lot of underservedness that's gonna, you know, proliferate. And I'm like, well, what do I want to grow? Well, I want Black thriving to grow. So that's centered in all the work. Um, so the first piece of work that the Institute is going to engage in is the Black Thriving Index. So it's a citywide qualitative study of the Black lived experience. And that really emerged from, you know, doing community engagement on all these projects where community voice doesn't get listened to. Like we create platforms to receive it in a very superficial way, but it doesn't really ever impact the outcome. So I'm like,
After
okay,
the fact, or like
yeah,
decisions have been
it's
made
way
and
too
then it's
late in the
like,
game.
let's ask
So
people what they think,
yes,
but then
so
don't do.
much has already been decided by the point we start asking people what they want and what they think. And it's also been my contention and experience that people who you know, haven't been in full possession of their imagination, when you, so much of your day is spent struggling to survive, you don't have the proper agency to imagine your best future. So people
Scarcity
need,
mindset, right? I mean, it's
yeah, you just,
even
yeah,
in nonprofit world, I would have that, I'd be like,
totally.
and I still don't have enough money. I don't have, and then you'd have a session. They say, what would you do with, if you had $1 million? And it's like, you can't even imagine
You
that.
can't even get
You're
there.
like, pay our
Yes,
bills, like pay our,
yes.
or hire a
So,
person.
yes, a lot of the work of the Institute is also helping people activate their wildest dreams. So, we're going to do a lot of work about science fiction and Afrofuturism to help expand people's imagination about what's possible. When you ask
Ingrid
people,
LaFleur,
yeah, I
have you
love Ingrid.
talked
Yeah,
with Ingrid
of
before?
course.
She did worked with us a little too. She's like in Detroit, but not really. She's not where she's like just all
No,
over, I feel like.
she's in Africa. Last
Yeah.
I talked to her, she was in Rwanda and planning to go to South Africa, I think. So she's on the continent. What I love about Ingrid was like, yeah, Detroit is too oppressive for me. So that forced me to think about like, wow, a place that is 80% black is too oppressive for a black person. Like we got to address these things. But I didn't finish about the Black Thriving
Yeah.
Index. So
Sorry.
citywide qualitative analysis of black lived experience, responding to the fact that in most of the cases where we're planning for black communities, we're not really listening to people, or we do in a very superficial way, or we're asking questions that keep people rooted in the present versus having conversations about what our, you know, thriving as black future should look like. Um, so what that looks like is hiring people of the community to have conversations with people they're already in relationship with. I have before done door to doors as a graduate student, and even though I am black and a resident of Detroit, there's still this very um, outsider kind of approach to talking to people about what they want for their community. So I want to eliminate any of that kind of feeling. Also, understanding that people have been surveyed to death in this town. So I'm trying to think of what is the least extractive way to better understand what's inside people's heads. And to me, that came like, oh, you just pay people of the community to have conversations with people they already know, but not pay people like, you know, a stipend. Like I'm giving people a whole salary, and also some supports in being able to have really good conversations, really generative conversations. In addition to doing this research, these fellows will be engaged in a program where we study thriving black communities historically. So nowhere in my urban planning studies did we study like Idlewild or Black Bottom Paradise Valley or Black Wall Street in Tulsa. Like these are all things that I came to understand later on through my own research. But how would it have expanded my imagination about Detroit if I had had black examples of prosperity beforehand? So the fellows will get to learn that. You know, we're going to take some trips to places, hear from some speakers. Um, there will also be some ritual involved. I think that black folks connecting to our ancestral practices also just increases our capacity to, to love ourselves more and love our culture more. I think we're programmed to think that Black is bad, even Black folks. So what does it look like to explore these things that are, things that our ancestors did? How does that connect us to our history and our culture? Let's see, what are the other principles? Connecting to ancestry. I also want to give all of these fellows an ancestry.com membership because I found it a tremendous source of pride, and it strengthened my resolve in my work to know that what my ancestors did. Like, I have a great grandfather who fought in the Civil War, but I read an article that said he also worked as a conductor on the Underground Railroad toward the liberation of his people. And I was like, that's what I'm doing. So I think there is someone like that in everybody's lineage, and I want these fellows to find out like who in their ancestry, whose work are they carrying on. So like this program isn't just to like get this research, it's also to help, um, you know, foster a transformation in these people that will then, in theory, be contagious. So how can this idea of Black thriving spread like a virus throughout the city?
It's amazing. And when you define, because I think I've heard you talk about it before, like what does Black thriving look like, or what are the
Yeah,
pieces of Black
I have
thriving?
a working definition. I think it has three components. So the first is agency. Like, you need to understand your own capacity um, to impact your life. A lot of people don't feel like they feel like life is happening to them
Yeah.
versus having some control over it. So if you are Black and thriving, you're in full possession of your agency. The next A is abundance, and that means fulfillment in all the areas. It's not just financially. It's like you have solid relationships, your work is rewarding, you take care of yourself. I think that something I picked up from the activist community in Detroit is like we wear like the working hard and the not having money is like a badge of honor. Like, I'm in this struggle too. But like, who are you helping if you're just signing up for struggle? Who is that for? You know? So trying to counter that and being like, no, abundance is our birthright. Like, it's okay to have. Um, and then the third A being audacity, and that is being able to show up 100% your full self in whatever setting you're in. And I think a lot about peers and colleagues of mine who might have a good job title and make a lot of money, but the person they have to be every day in order to maintain that isn't really who they are. So I think that to me doesn't look like thriving. Like, thriving is like you get to show up your whole Black ass self in like whatever setting you're in and still be able to maintain. So what does it look like for Black folks to show up, in just a really audacious way? So if those three things are working for you, then you're Black and thriving.
And this one, it just speaks to the whole messed up system that it's audacity to just be yourself, right?
It is, because we are so programmed to not do
yeah,
that from
yeah,
every direction. I was thinking recently about how maybe 10 years ago when I started wearing my hair natural, I got it from my mom. She's like, I don't know why you did that. And I was like, what? And she's like, well, things are just going to be harder for you. And I'm like, how are you telling me that like my natural appearance is going to make things harder for me? You should be saying like, going out there and get them, show them who you are. Like, but like, even
she's
from
not
like,
wrong. That's her that's the experience, right?
right.
That's a
But like,
double-edged sword. Yeah.
if even within my own Black, you know, immediate family are these messages of like, suppress your cultural nature, like, what does it look like to counter all that?
Yeah. And that was part of the trip to Paris. Could you just talk a
Oh,
little?
yeah.
That was
So
one of the.
that feeds into the Black Thriving Index. I wanted to take Black folks that I knew who were thriving and again let them serve as like a permission slip for like taking time off, celebrating your culture, centering the Black lived experience. Like, I have been a part of cohorts that have gone places, and mostly white groups with a couple of black folks where we just couldn't talk about race at all. Like, I'll get specific. So I think, thinking back to, I went on a trip to Copenhagen with the Knight Foundation. So they took a bunch of people from all over the country that were leading different initiatives to go experience like public life in Copenhagen. And like the story we got was, they have a really high quality of life. Whenever you're measuring like well-being, Scandinavia is always top of the charts. But what didn't get discussed, we talked to elected officials, we talked to residents, like their equivalent of like nonprofit leadership, but no one addressed the idea of racial difference. So the black folks in the group, like after all the day's presentations, we were having our own conversation. Like, why didn't they talk about race at all? It's really interesting. This is a very homogenous community, and we're not really talking about, we can't apply any of this stuff because in America it's very different.
I mean, they have
So
to have
my,
minor,
yeah.
Or
They have a lot.
minority
They have
communities.
immigrants, but they
Yeah,
didn't. They
yeah,
weren't
they didn't talk.
considered in any of these
Yeah.
presentations. That like wasn't addressed at all. So for those of us that live in a state of difference, we were like, man, how is that not part of the conversation? So I was like, what if that was the center of a conversation? I'm going to take an all black group to a place where we exist in smaller numbers and center that part of the experience in the conversation. What does it look like to do that? And what does it look like to go there in the name of celebrating one of our own? So we went around the induction of Josephine Baker into the Pantheon. And the big question for me was like, why is a place like France putting this Black American entertainer into this, this vault with all of their war heroes and other luminaries? So it was really around trying to understand that, but also just us being able to center our experience in the conversation in a way that we can't even hear, you know? Um, Lots of people in power get very uncomfortable when you center the Black lived experience, even in a place that's 80% Black. So I was like, okay, let's take everybody out of their hustle mode. Like, you have to set aside like all of your meetings and all of your deadlines and everything that you have to do. You're going to leave that at home. And then we're going to go have this really Black centered experience in this other place and just kind of, see what happens. And I also wanted them to like, share the pictures and share the experience, again, as like a permission slip for others to do that. And like, I heard a bit of feedback, like I talked to Kendall Waterman, who is Kaylin. You know Kaylin. Hey, she used to work for you too.
Yeah.
So Kendall, though, is
Yeah.
like doing some narration for my website. And she's like, Lauren, when I saw those pictures that my sister posted of that trip, I was like, man, I should be doing that. I want to go have a cultural experience. I want to go see what it's like to center the Black lived experience for a minute. And that's exactly what it's supposed to do.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And what was the like? Okay, well, we can talk about. There's so much stuff to talk about. We'll have to have you on again because, and then we'll also continue this over dinner or wine sometime too. But my final question is, what's the call to action? It could be little like follow this on this, or it can be world peace. But if people listening to this or watching this want, are inspired to take action, what would you love to see them do?
That's a good question. Usually I do come prepared with a call to action. I really, I consider my work like changing hearts and mind space, which is really hard to measure, right? Like,
Yes.
you're a real estate developer, like there was no building, now there's a building. You can be like, I
feel you.
did that.
Yeah, I
But
feel you
like,
on
if
that
you're
one.
trying to activate a different kind of consciousness in people, like it's hard to measure. But I will say, like, I would like people to, stew on the concept of Black thriving. If you are a nonprofit leader, if you work in philanthropy, if you're anyone who has anywhere in your mission the idea of helping Black people, like, go over your work with a fine-tooth comb and try to understand, like, in what ways does it contribute to Black people thriving? Like, are you operating from a place where you understand we have everything we need internally and it just needs to be set free? Or are you operating from a place like we're a hot mess of people who need assistance? like each of those ethoses, ethi, each of those ethoses like have a different set of, work that comes with it. And I would just hope that people are operating from a place like we have everything we need within, instead of like, you need my help. So just, I would like people to just meditate for a moment on the concept of Black thriving and think about, like, is your work really doing that? If you one of those people that's saying the thing, like, is your work really centering us thriving?
Awesome. And is there a website or social media for the Institute or
Hmm.
for yourself that you want to share?
So actually, this weekend, as part of my half-century birthday celebration, we'll be launching all the socials. So there is an Insta, which is AfroUrbanism. There's a Facebook page, which is AfroUrbanism, Facebook.com/AfroUrbanism, and there's a website, AfroUrbanism.com. So it's not hard to remember. Just AfroUrbanism on all the things. But yes, we'll be launching as of March 5th all those platforms. But right now, there is a mailing list up where you can sign up on the website.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lauren, for taking the time, and thank you all of you for joining us today. A lot to think about, a lot to stew on, and we hope to see you again on our next Discuss Detroit episode. Of course, follow us on the City Institute on social media and on YouTube for other videos, and like and rate, and I don't know, I'm not really into all that stuff yet, but I'm sure that's what you're supposed to do, right? uh,
Subscribe.
yeah, subscribe, rate, all those things. But hopefully this and our other conversations are helping you feel more connected to what's going on in Detroit. And thanks so much, everybody.